If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Viking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. The most abundant ingredient used to make beer is barley that goes through the malting process, which makes the starches contained therein capable of being enzymatically converted into fermentable sugar. In order for this to occur, the malt must be crushed, then steeped in water that falls within a specific temperature range for enough time to allow for complete conversion. As most brewers were taught, this typically falls somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes. But is that really necessary? You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott. And in this episode, I'm joined by contributor Andy Carter to talk about the impact of reducing the mash length, particularly as it pertains to blonde ale.
Yeah, so there's a common thing. You read your books, you get your first pamphlet or whatever on homebrewing, and they say 60 minutes. And a lot of times, I think when you learn some new activity, you just want to stick to the rote processes, right? You don't know what you're doing yet. You don't know what you don't know. And so just sticking to those rote processes makes sense. But as you mature and matriculate through the thing, well, you start to question these things. Should I really boil for 60 minutes? Should I really mash for 60 minutes? How should fermentation take 2 weeks? And so I wanted to look at the impact of reducing the mash length to see if there was anything we could pick up in a panel.
Yeah. When I first started experimenting with brewing, one of the top 5 variables on my list of things to test was this whole mash length thing. You're told, like you mentioned, Andy, you're told right at the start that you have to mash for at least 60 minutes, no less. Otherwise, you risk not fully converting those starches into fermentable sugars. Now, I think it's important to point out that the impetus for the whole experiment series was to demonstrate why the, quote, rules that we follow in brewing are important, not the other way around, as a lot of people seem to presume, meaning I was convinced that failing to mash for the prescribed amount of time would ultimately result in a beer of lower quality than those mashed at, for 60 minutes or more. That was nearly 8 years ago. I look forward to talking about this topic with you today, Andy, as well as the results of a rad experiment that you performed on it. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, that's July of 2022, Associate Sensory Scientist at John I. Haas and good friend of Brewlosophy, Jeff Daly, will be hanging out with patrons. He's an absolute wizard when it comes to hops, and his work involves helping us all to better understand our favorite flower more, and he was recently actually a guest on The Brew Lab hosted by Cade Job. Go check that episode out. Super interesting stuff, talking about the words that we use to describe hop character. This is going to be a really great session. To be a part of it, you got to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, July 29th, as Jeff's going to be taking questions on Saturday the 30th. All past sessions are stored on both our private Patreon page and Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate it immensely. Not only does this help those who haven't heard of the show yet more easily find it, but it's nice to know how you think we're doing. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who in addition to having a remarkable YouTube channel chock full of great brewing related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120 volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240 volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. All right, James Morgan had some feedback on our episode where we talked about skipping the boil when making hazy IPA. James said, I loved this episode and thought you covered all all of the reasons you would boil wort pretty comprehensively, except that the boiling process also forces dissolved gas out of solution. The solubility of gas in liquid increases as temperature decreases. Conversely, gases are forced out of liquid solution as temperature increases. Have you ever tried making ice cream from boiled water rather than straight from the tap? The boiled water ice is less cloudy. Oh, not ice cream, ice. The boiled water ice is less cloudy because there's less dissolved air. The gas comes out of solution as the liquid freezes. This is important for hazy IPA because, as we know, air contains oxygen. So ostensibly, boiled wort should contain less oxygen than if it had not been boiled. What do you think about the idea that a no-boil wort is more susceptible to oxidation?
That's a great question. I never thought about that. I think in the first order, the yeast you pitch will consume that oxygen.
Yeah.
So you're going to have a thing. I don't know how much you're going to have. It's not going to have 10 ppm of oxygen. It's going to have something on the order of a few ppm, because 10 ppm you have to really agitate the wort, right? You have to really work on the wort to get it to 5 even, and then real pure oxygen for 10. So there's a few ppm, and I believe it's if yeast can consume 10 ppm, they can consume 2 ppm or something like that. So I think you wouldn't necessarily see it. Now maybe this would be a good test, is to do it or not do it and then see the change. But I think the lack of boiling with oxygen will still be lighter, because I've noticed, at least in some of the no-boil Berliner Weisses I do, the wort is quite clear and quite light. And so there's kind of a trade-off between not boiling with oxygen and then boiling without oxygen. I think you pick up a little color when you boil, a little, just a touch, not Maillard reaction, not brown, right? But something. And so I think there's a trade-off, though. I think what you'll end up finding is the flavor impact will be so much greater due to the lack of boiling than any type of oxygen egress.
Yeah, so I've never done a no boil that method. I've always boiled my wort. Now, obviously, I do a lot of the short and shoddy stuff, so I've boiled for as low as 15 minutes, but I've never done a real no boil.
Yeah.
My understanding is that, according to what Malcolm used to tell me, is that when he would do like a no-boil Berliner or whatever, that the malt character was a little bit more doughy, but he never talked about like increased oxidative character. Mm-hmm. Seeing as yeast require oxygen as a nutrient, kind of like you pointed out, Andy, a lot of brewers opt to oxygenate their wort after the boil regardless, prior to pitching their yeast, because that yeast needs it. So I'm not really sure boiling has any real impact on cold side oxidation at all. Yeah. I would presume, again, anecdotal, I have not done a no boil, so I have to just go based off of my understanding of the brewing process. Mm-hmm. I have to assume that it's not going to have any impact whatsoever. And in the experiment that we ended up discussing, Cade was unable to reliably distinguish the boiled hazy IPA from the no boil version anyways.
Wow.
Yeah,
yep.
I'm not sure it matters. He as the guy who brewed those beers, and I think a lot of people these days are very, very, they're focused heavily on cold side oxidation, particularly with that style of beer.
Yes.
I would trust that Cade would have at least picked that up if that was the case, and it did not seem to be the case.
It's a sensitive beer to oxidation, right? If any beer that's made commercially or homebrew today, it's one of the most sensitive, especially in appearance, if not flavor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he would have seen something, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a great thought, James. And this is what I love about homebrewers, is we kind of go down these rabbit holes and we start wondering how certain little things impact, and that's how development and progress is made, right? I mean, so
exactly.
Thinking about these things, I'm basing largely, my presumption on this, on the fact that Cade could not distinguish those beers, and then what I understand about the brewing process. But maybe there's something there, James, and I appreciate you writing in with the feedback for us. So if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. So those who have been around long enough may recall the earlier days of Brewlosophy, when I used to post, these videos on our YouTube channel. In fact, to this day, I still get contacted by people asking about my experience eating a pack of baker's yeast mixed in with yogurt as a way to avoid getting drunk. Pro tip, don't do that unless you like bowel issues. Over time, I decided to focus my energy on the website and this podcast for various reasons, the most biggest one being time. Let's just say that I've been feeling kind of bad for those out there who have been begging us to do more videos. And I would encourage you all to go check out the Brewlosophy YouTube channel. It's one that people can subscribe to right now so that they're notified of any future updates. All right, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on reducing mash length when brewing blonde ale. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. When I take a step back and really think about it, brewing involves quite a few steps, though there are some that I tend to view as being, bigger, perhaps even more important than others, without which beer would not be possible. One of these steps is the mash.
Yeah, so for those that have not really dug into the processes, maybe you've homebrewed a couple times but not thought about all these different steps. So the mash is just kind of a term for the part where you extract sugar from the barley or any grain you're going to use. You can mash wheat, you can mash oats, all these things. This kind of term mash X or Y. Not every grain has its own enzymatic power, which we'll get into in a minute, but the mash is this place of taking a solid carbohydrates and liquefying them with water or other minerals and stuff like that.
Right, and converting that solid carbohydrate into something that yeast can ferment, that yeast can consume to produce alcohol as a byproduct, and CO2 as well, of course. I used to tell people they pee alcohol and they fart CO2, right? That's the easy way for my dumb brain to understand
it. It is because we're all 14-year-old boys when we're recording this podcast. So let's make it really simple for everyone. That's what we talk about.
Yeah, so, now the science of Marshall, right? That's the
So this process involves essentially crushing up these grains and then adding water. And usually the water has to be of some temperature. Usually it's in the hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit. And we'll get into those specifics in a minute. But basically, you're going to hold this thing, this cereal, this liquid of water and grains, anywhere between 148 Fahrenheit and 64 Celsius to 164 Fahrenheit or 73 Celsius. Now, this is generally for barley malt. That's what we're going to focus on in this experiment today, during which these enzymes, and we've talked about enzymes on previous episodes, but enzymes allow certain chemical reactions to proceed much more quickly than others. There's kind of this equilibrium balance of these chemical reactions going on, but enzymes encourage a certain direction to form, and these are called amylase enzymes. And that ASE, that last term, that ASE means they're going to take those sugars and cut them up and create smaller sugars along the way, and those are what we call the starch conversion in the process.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out, most brewers out there already understand this, but just to be as thorough as possible, if you can't just go and shake some wheat or barley off of a stalk and then throw that in a mash. You do have to. It has to be malted. The malting process is what starts that. It gives the grain the ability then to have that starch converted into a fermentable sugar. So that's why when we talk about things like diastatic power, I know we're going to get into that in a minute, but you talk about that. That is a function of the malt, not necessarily just the grain. So now when it comes to these enzymes, this is not a show that's specifically on mash temperature, but I think it's important in terms of looking at mash length to also break down these different temperature rests. There's two main ones that we look at in modern brewing today. I think single infusion mashing is the most popular approach to brewing currently. Obviously, there were step mashes and such in the past, and there were reasons for that. But right now, currently, the single infusion mash is what most people do. And I think most brewers understand that if you mash at a cooler, quote, cooler temperature, around that 148F or 64C point, plus or minus 3 or 4 degrees, you are activating those beta amylase enzymes. They're going to be more active at that lower temperature. And that means that they're going to chop those long chain dextrins into shorter chain, highly fermentable sugars. You're going to make a wort that is more fermentable. Whereas if you mash a little bit warmer, you're going to activate those alpha amylase enzymes, which are, again, more active at those warmer temperatures and result in more long chain sugars being in that wort. Those long chain sugars are more difficult for the yeast to ferment, to metabolize. And so you're going to end up with I don't want to say a sweeter wort because we've done a lot of mash temp experiments that don't seem to flesh that out, but you're going to result in a less fermentable wort, meaning that there's going to be more long chain dextrins around in that beer in the end.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things with these enzymes. These are proteins that are folded up and they change as temperature changes. So they have a optimum points. They don't not work at other temperatures. They just are the best, the most efficient at certain temperatures. And this kind of gets to this discussion of time, like how much time does one need to do these things? So with these two enzymes, you're really, if you start the lower one, you're not activating the upper one. And actually, if you're at the upper one, you might start to lose the ability to use the lower temperature one. So there's kind of a balancing act there. If you know, some people like overshoot the mash temperature, get a little worried. Well, they are degrading, but if you want to cool it down fast enough, I mean, there is this ability to maintain. So that's why hitting your mash temperature, actually the initial one, is kind of critical. Is that you're trying to hit a certain temperature. I recommend, I always tell people if they're starting out, don't worry about the certain temperature so much because we have so much data that suggests mash temperature is not really what you're looking for, but maybe undershoot your temperature and then add hot water to get to the number and just be cool with that, and you'll be fine. Right.
And you mentioned that if you go in too hot, the term that you'll hear associated with what happens to enzymes when the temperature gets a little too warm is denaturing. You'll denature those enzymes, so they can't do what they were intended to do in the first place, or whatever you might have wanted them to do at that lower temp. So you got to be careful with that. Again, we've done a lot of experiments looking at the impact of mash temperature, different mash temperatures, and it really doesn't seem to produce a perceptible difference. But one absolutely well-known, well-established thing that it does do is impact fermentability. You can take the same exact mash, the same exact grain bill, temperature of water, volume of water, all of that side by side, one being 148 degrees Fahrenheit, the other being 164 degrees Fahrenheit, and that 164 is going to finish fermenting sooner and have a higher FG than the one that's mashed cooler. Now, when it comes to mash length, one of the things that we know, and I don't know, I can't speak to the reason for this. I'm not that smart, but one thing we know, and calculators, I think most of the brewing software out there will account for this. If you are doing a warmer mash, they will say you don't need to mash as long than if you're doing a cooler mash. And the way my brain kind of works its way around that to try to understand that is that you are already, you're not necessarily looking for as much conversion anyways, right? When you're doing those warmer mash steps or those warmer mash temps anyways. And so you might be able to get away with 45 minutes or as opposed to a 60-minute mash rest.
Yeah, I think to me and to my the thought process there is that the higher temperature, there's just more chemical reactions going on. I mean, anytime there's higher temps going on, things are happening more quickly. So you're saying, okay, well, it's just happening faster. I do like the idea that you're just doing less work. Yeah. So there's temperature and less work. I mean, that makes sense, right? So I think I see it both ways. I've read, I think like a lot of things we talk about in homebrewing, you can find the answer on either side of this. So it's kind of like, you kind of have to just use your own knowledge, own gut reaction and come up with a term. And I think both are valid.
Yeah. And regardless, I think most people end up just setting their timer for 60 minutes anyways, right? I mean, that's so incredibly common. It's what most brewers are recommended to do. And this might lead us down some philosophical little rabbit holes here, but why do you think we settled on 60 minutes, Andy?
So first, I think an hour is a very common unit of time in brewing. Other than the fermentation and everything else, a brew day can be chopped up into anywhere between 5 and 8 hours, let's say. And I think just having that hour is good. It's fine. I think some of it was, it's not like a home brewer went out and, there's ways of testing. I mean, of course, there's the iodine test to know if you're fully converted or not. That's a very common one to know if your starches are still present or not. And then what you do there is you take a little bit of wort during the mashing process and you add iodine, and there's a color change depending on if it's fully converted or not. And so you can see how much time it is. Now, I really think the hour comes from just being a safe thing. I think you can mash too long, of course. I mean, there's people that mash overnight and they don't seem to have a problem. You can mash less, and what's the impact? Is it just not enough sugar? So there's that whole thing. I think really, if I came down to it, I think the hour comes from a time and place in brewing when grain was not as nearly as fermentable as it is, not nearly as what we'll call hot, which we'll talk about what that means in a minute. And that's where it's just like, well, we don't know how long it's going to take. Just say 60 minutes, I think.
I'm with you. I think that, for some reason, society settled on 60 minutes being this meaningful, chunk of time. And so it's just easier to say an hour. It's why classes go for 50 minutes and you have 10 minutes to walk between them. We could just as easily have settled on something else, and maybe that's what people use. I do think that there is an element. Again, this is utter speculation. I was not alive, 3 centuries ago. But I do think that there's also an element of overkill that when in brewing, like you called it a safety thing, right?
Yes.
You're just kind of padding your potential results. And I feel like it could have been. I mean, we're going to talk about malt and the impact that malt likely had, over time, over history, that the type of malt likely had on the way that we brew even today. But I do feel like there's an element in brewing of overkill where it's like, okay, we know that if we hold it for 60 minutes, maybe it was already done converting at 30 minutes, maybe it was done converting at 25 minutes, who knows? But if we go 60, you're not hurting anything. You're just taking more time out of your day. You may as well just do that so that you can get as much out of those grains as possible. Now, when I talk to pro brewers, and we, you and I think a lot of people in home brewing these days, especially, they have friends that have gone pro. They know people who are brewing on 20 barrel, 40 barrel systems. They're not doing what we do on the homebrew scale. They might call it the same thing. Oh yeah, about a 60-minute mash, but they are not doing it the way we are. And we as homebrewers emulate the pros to a degree sometimes that I think might actually hinder, our performance as homebrewers sometimes. Their 60-minute mash is usually also involves like transfers, right? And other things going on. So.
Well, you have to, I think, pay attention to, there's something, there's an important distinction in the two things. Like, so a home brewer versus a pro brewer, I think our goals are similar, though. We want to make good beer. We want to make something we want to drink, right? But they also have this, and I think homebrewers are finally catching on to this nowadays, is that pro brewers, time is money, right? Yeah. Money is time, time is money. So when they're doing stuff, it's like, does this make the beer better? Yes or no? Does it save time? Because that's always going to be a better use of tank space, of hot side time, all that stuff. So what I've seen and when I've watched people use bigger systems is when they're mashing and they're crushing as water is being added, right? So the mash is happening, immediately, right? They're having this mash is starting immediately. And almost as soon as the thing is full, it could take 20 minutes to fill a 20 barrel mash tun, right? You're converted, right? So that now they're just recirculating a bit, maybe 10 minutes, and then they're pumping it into the boil kettle, right? So there's this whole thing that time. And finally, I think now we as homebrewers are catching on, especially with electric systems that might be a little slower. I mean, I went from propane to electric for Brewlosophy, and my time increased dramatically because my electric 120 system takes longer, right? So wait, hold on, how can I pull some time back into my brew day because it's taking longer, right? So what I do at home is I do 60-minute. We do keep things consistent throughout these experiments, right? Unless we see a very specific reason to change that, right? We try to be consistent. This is a variable, of course. So what I do at the time is I just plan other stuff. I'm mashing, well, I'm cleaning fermenters. I'm boiling, well, I'm getting something else ready, or I'm getting hops ready, or something like that, right? And so there's this time aspect that if you want to get time back, why not be less time? Because it seems, at least the pro side, they kind of just go for it. And 30 minutes, no problem. So that's an open thing.
And I'm sure there are commercial brewers out there who do the iodine test to ensure that they've got maximum conversion. There's also a money component, like you mentioned earlier, Andy, is on the homebrew scale, if you're not getting, 86% conversion or whatever it might be, and you're getting 82 instead, you're not losing anything. That is like a handful of grains difference, right? On the pro scale, that might be multiple sacks, and they want to conserve as much as they can. And, bottom line is bottom line. That's what they want, they're focused on. So that's another component as well. They're going to hold their they might, hold their mash a little bit longer to ensure maximum conversion. But again, I don't think that they're doing iodine tests. None of the pros that I know are doing it every batch, at least, No,
not every batch.
Yeah,
I think mostly they're doing, what they're doing along the way, just so we talk a little bit more about, they're doing a lot more just analysis just to make sure the wort is consistent and the same. Because what they do will make sure the mash, make sure they're going in with the right OG, because they can adjust things over time. They do 3 or 4 batches simultaneously. So, I'm a little low on this one, I'll come a little high on this one. But they know their system really well and they're very consistent. At the same time, they're also like, well, we know we'll get close, right? We know they have that experiential knowledge that, hey, the it's 14 Play-Doh. Okay, that'll be fine. It doesn't need to be 15 today. We're good. So that's kind of balancing act. That's the professional experience they have that they're putting into it. That if you're a home brewer like Marshall or myself or anyone on Brewlosophy, that we have so much time and experience, we know we could be close and feel comfortable. So
yeah, exactly. So let's talk about the role malt plays in mash length specifically. There are multiple variables that you have to focus on when it comes to malt, and we know historically that the malts used back then. You mentioned a term hot malt earlier. We know that malts have gotten much hotter, as it were. Let's talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah. So malt, we said you can't just go out to the field and grab a bunch of barley and think you can make beer with it. That's unmalted. Malting is a process of steeping and basically faking the barley out to germinate. So there's these big, beautiful rooms. I've yet to go to a malt house. I know Marshall's been to a bunch. I've yet to go on. I need to see one. But basically, this ability to give the malt a little bit of water, and that makes it think it's being planted, so it germinates. And that process of germination encourages the formation of enzymes on the outside of the malt. And then you kind of halt the malting process. You stop it because you just get rid of its water and start to dry it. And now you have a malt you have a piece of barley grain, which is now called malt, that has a level of enzymes on it that allow it to convert itself. It's called self-conversion. That's one of the miracles, really the miracles of barley.
It's amazing.
They can create the enzymes that will then they create the enzymes that will then cut up the sugars inside the barley to create a fermentable beverage. Yeah. So when we say hot, or this gets to what's something called diastatic power, is that it's the ability for the malt to convert itself. And we talk about base malt. If you look at a recipe, sometimes you'll see a DP or diastatic power. That means the malt has this much power, and it'll be usually base malts are above 100, which means when you do the calculations, which I have not done in years, but just suffice it to say, you need to take so much basic barley malt, and you can add other things that don't have enzymes, crystal malts, roasted malts, all those things. Those can be added to convert, or adjuncts, corn, wheat, whatever. That will allow the whole thing to convert itself and any other ancillary malt or any ancillary grains. Yeah. So that's the diastatic power. So what we say hot means it has a lot of diastatic power, much more than it actually needs to convert itself.
And another term that we use when talking about malt is modification, how modified the malt is. We know historically that malts were under modified. You hear people even today saying, well, if you're going to use Bohemian Pilsner, floor malted Bohemian Pilsner or something like that is, going to be under modified often. And so it's going to require special treatment for adequate conversion to occur, namely things like step mashes or extended mash rests. The idea being those enzymes are going to take longer because the degree to which that endosperm and the proteins in the grain are broken down is much lower in under modified malt than it is in this quote hotter, modern malt that we get. And I'm talking I've had conversations with a couple of craft maltsters and pro brewers who are like, man, the malt we're getting today, you can hold it for like 25 minutes sometimes and you're fully converted. It is, the stuff just has that, like you kind of called it the magic of malt. I love that. It just has this ability to do this thing we want it to do so much more effectively and seemingly faster than in the past, than what brewers could get away with in the past.
Yeah, exactly. So like we have this with this under modified. I think we've had plenty of conversations about what's the need for a decoction mash or a step mash, and that really all those things come from the fact that back in the day, malt was just not as convertible as it was in the past, and you need these higher temperature steps to break down long chain sugars and make them fermentable. So for home brewers, in general, if you're going to the store and just buying malt, you're not going to have this problem. You don't see that at all. You don't see this at all. Now, what you are seeing, which is super cool, in my opinion, because we've not experienced this, is that the new craft maltsters out there can offer you the ability to tailor that that modification, that diastatic power, where I am very happy in my experience, in my experimental, my fun homebrewing stuff to be like, hey, I have this sack of raw Pilsner or raw 2-row, which is perfectly fine, makes a great beer. Yep. But I want to play with a new malt that exchanges fermentability modification for flavor. Right? I want to know what the difference is when it's under modified and what flavors am I going to get versus that. And that's what really I think the cool part is. And that's kind of the next kind of step in a lot of people's homebrewing is playing with the malt a lot more. Yeah.
And it has an impact. I was just at Crone Wolf yesterday collecting some data on an experiment with Paul. And the brewer was there, Brad. You guys have all heard his voice before on this show. And he brought me over a sample of a beer that I'd had multiple times before. But I told him, man, something's different about this. And he goes, yeah, I went out. He was using I don't know if I would call it a craft malt, but a smaller maltster's malt that he got a pallet of just for messing around with. He had been using that for this beer previously, and he goes, yeah, this one is just Weirmann Pilsner malt instead, and it was noticeably different. It tasted to me like a beery beer that everybody, because that's what everyone's using. But you look at, we didn't talk about, his mash process or anything like that, but you look at these malts from what I'll call big malt, big maltsters, Weirmann, Great Western, Rar, stuff like that. And they are producing these malts that are, again, they're just super hot. They do exactly what you need them to do. And there's good reason for that. They want the people who are buying their product to be able to rely on it for consistency so that they can produce the product that they're expected or expected by the customers to produce, and that they're hoping to produce. And I like that. I also love, like you said, that there are these craft maltsters out there that are intentionally making less modified malts so that brewers can play around with that process, almost kind of tapping into the romantic history of brewing on some level, but then also potentially being able to use different processes like decoction mashing or step mashing that may bring out different characteristics from in the beer.
Yeah, exactly. It's such another place that we've not played with, because I think in general, I do think there's a difference between all the maltsters. We've done experiments on this where base malts or who they come from or where, but to have that extra a new variable, right, that we've not seen in the past, I think that'd just be a fantastic place to play.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the purported negatives of not mashing for 60 minutes or longer. I remember, back when I jumped into all grain brewing, this is 14, 15 years ago now. And, I'm reading everything real closely, and the way everything is written and prescribed is a word I like to use. You have to do this. If you don't do this, then thou shalt. Yeah, exactly. And, one of the big things that I used to read about reduced mash length, and I don't know how accurate this is. I don't even know where it came from, but that if you don't mash long enough, that you could end up with a beer that has a quote grainy flavor. And to me, a lot of beers have what I would call a grainy flavor, but I'm kind of thinking maybe more husky grainy as opposed to that nice barley grain flavor that I actually like. Have you heard that one, Andy?
No, I can't say I've heard that one. I'm trying to think of where it would even start, and I do wonder in some of these cases when people have odd flavors or things come up, I do wonder the provenance of their ingredients sometimes.
Me too.
Where in the shop was this dusty bag that says has a odd date on it and stuff, and you put the grain between your teeth and you crack a molar.
It's so old,
and it's like, and it seizes up the grain mill because it can't be crushed. So it's I'm not buying it. I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure it's happened. I'm sure someone's seen this in the past, but I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know.
My hunch is that, like so many things in brewing, one person mashed a beer for 45 minutes instead of 60. They didn't really like the results. They ended up describing subjectively their experience with that beer as quote grainy, put it on Homebrew Talk, I read it, and then I just accepted it, right? I mean, that's part of what inspired Brewlosophy, was I was getting sick of all of these anecdotal reports.
Yeah.
And I would rather have at least some semblance of like stats to go along with a claim, right? One thing that's pretty for sure though, when it comes to mashing for less than 60 minutes, is that there is a high potential that you're not going to get as much conversion, arguably, right?
Yes.
Which is going to result in a wort that has lower OG, and then you're going to ferment it. It's going to be lower ABV, and that could lead to what people describe as maybe a watery beer, particularly for those beers that are lower OG to start with.
Exactly. So it's like, if we can kind of think, and it makes sense. I mean, there is like a mental thing, like my OG, it references some type of density to the thing, right? So if there's less of it, there's less sense it could be watery. We've said this before, we've done a lot of mash experiments, varying levels of certificants or that kind of thing. But it makes sense, right? If it's you would know, like me and Marshall can say, we've had this, right? There's a difference between a light lager and a barley wine, right? It's not just the alcohol content. There is something to the malt that is adding some levels of mouthfeel to the beer, right? There is something that's changing its viscosity in your mouth, right? Now, of course, alcohol, that's a light thing. It's 70% the density of water, right? It is going to lighten a beer up. Don't get it wrong.
Yeah.
But the amount of malt has some impact. Now, is OG everything, or is it the consistency, the chemical makeup of the sugars that are left in the beer after fermentation? I think that's a much bigger impact than the number, this objective measurement, right? We don't put our worts through complicated chemistry and analysis and quantitative, spectroscopy to find out what's in it, right? There's a whole host of sugars that make it up. And so, yes, to the first order, the OG matters, but how much? Good question.
Yeah, good question. Now, I do want to point out back 10 or so years ago, there was a home brewer out there who was doing, well before Brewlosophy was around, was doing some really, really thorough, cool experimentation on his own. His name's Kai Troyster. If you go back to old Basic Brewing Radio, we love James Spencer, we love Steve, you guys. Go check out Basic Brewing Radio. But if you go back to some of those older episodes, you will see that Kai used to go on that show quite often. And I recall one episode where he was talking about his experiments with mash length. And you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. Don't quote me on this, but I believe what he found was, in essence, a good portion of the starches were converted by 15 minutes into the mash. And I think he was doing like a pretty moderate mash temp, 152, 154, something like that. That a good portion were converted by 15 minutes, and then by 30 minutes into the mash, it was something like 85%. And then anything after that was so gradual that it was almost kind of like, well, you could cut it off anytime after 30 minutes, really, and you're not losing too much. You might eke a couple more points, out of it, of mash efficiency out of it. But ultimately, that 30-minute mark is really up to that 30-minute mark is really where you're getting that massive increase in conversion of starches into sugars. Do you recall that one, Andy?
Yeah, I remember he did a lot of it. Honestly, and then he's got his own Wikipedia still, the Braukaiser. It's some fantastic level of research.
Amazing.
He goes so in depth on this. Yeah. I remember he's doing mini mashes, like 100-gram mashes into a thermos and stuff like that. So this makes sense, right? These chemical reactions usually there's a bulk of reaction, then the enzymes have to find, right? That's why you crush the grain. They have to find the sugars to cut up and then convert, right? So there's a whole thing. Homebrewers, we're not like mixing stuff, right? We don't have rakes and paddles and things like that. We're not as nearly as efficient. Every pro system is meant to maximize utilization of its ingredients. Yeah, mash tun, boil kettle, whirlpool, whatever. So there's this whole other step to it. So yeah, I do remember that experiment he ran, and it makes sense. But it's also diminishing returns. Yeah, and then there's measurement error, right? I don't trust my tools beyond one point of any degree, right? One here or there is not going to make I don't think, a perceptible difference in the beer, and it's a measurement error. So once you get to 30 minutes, you've got your grain. And then really, to me, it's not just about the number, it's the consistency, which is your system doing it the same way day in and day out, right? And so,
well, let's talk a little bit about how mash length might play a role with Blondale. And obviously we pick specific styles for these experiments, and then we go back and redo that variable with a different style, and we might change the parameters a little bit. So this isn't not specifically related to just Blondale, but we did use that style for this particular experiment we're going to talk about in the next segment. So let's talk a little bit about what we might expect from for example, a reduced mash length with American Blondale.
Yeah, so we picked these styles just to kind of maybe to accentuate something or try to drive something a little more up front, because, in theory, if you're making a simple beer and this is a simple tweak, and if it's buried behind something even bigger, some bigger flavors, are there adjuncts or what have you, you might miss it, or it might become so we want to just keep it simple and consistent. That's why you see, I think, a lot of the beers we make are this kind of thing. So Blondale, it's a relatively moderate alcohol beer, can be low, can be a little higher, not too much hopping. So what you would imagine is, if the purported things, there's going to be a waterier beer, more watery beer or something like that, you should pick this up in this beer, right? Because you're losing alcohol, and it's such a low alcohol content. If you lose a point of alcohol or percentage of alcohol, that's like 20%, maybe it's from 5% to 4%. Yeah, that's a measure. Not only objective difference. We've said this. We can measure all these differences, but as a perceived difference, that should be perceptible. So it could be a little thinner water. You might like it more, right? We don't know. Usually, we've said, what's the quality of the beer? Are we finding negatives? But honestly, more times than not, we're finding differences, but they're not structurally worse beers. Yeah. Right? No one's going to say, I hate this beer, I love this beer, because of the variable. It's personal perception, right? So is it perceptible, and then is it personal choice? So you imagine a little bit of that. But, other than that, that's what we're trying to see, is like, how much does this mash temperature, or mash length, matter for a beer like this? And this, I think, would be a good one, because it's just such a light beer to begin with. Exactly. There's nothing to hide behind. I mean, you often hear that with Pilsner or pale lagers in general. Blondale is kind of the ale version of that. It's super simple. To many people, it's kind of boring, and I think that's kind of what makes it a great style to test variables like mash length and mash, to things that we talk about as being what I refer to as being prescribed, that you have to do it a certain way. If there's going to be a difference caused by mash length, if there's going to be a graininess, if
if there's going to be a sweetness or wateriness, whatever that may be. Blonde ale is a perfect example to kind of accentuate that because there's really nothing for it to hide behind. So that's why we chose that for this one. Again, we talked about what you might expect from a reduced mash length overall, and perhaps they apply to blonde ale. Now, I spent the first part of my all grain brewing life mashing for at least 60 minutes, though often extending it to 90 minutes because that's what I read you should do for certain styles. I've messed around quite a bit with mashing for less time over the years, though. If you've been following the short and shoddy series, you understand that. And my experience has been surprisingly positive. Andy, you were interested to see how reducing mash length would affect a blonde ale recently, and you put it to the test. Results from that experiment are coming right up. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brulosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Xchillerator.com today. Mash for 60 minutes. You just have to. Otherwise, you risk ruining your batch of beer. Don't question it. Just do it. Well, Andy, you and I both have questioned this established, quote, rule of brewing, and you recently put it to the test.
Yeah, so it's very simple. We're going to brew a blonde ale, and we're going to do 2 side-by-side batches, one with 60 and one with 30-minute mashes. So 2 5-gallon batches of blonde ale on the Bruzilla Electric all-in-one systems. Simple grain bill, 100% pale 2-row malt.
Perfect.
Just want to keep it simple. Yep,
Exactly.
No reason to add anything to this beer. Honestly, maybe people add carapils, but I didn't even want that to add to the variable. I just want to talk about base malt.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a good place to start with this one because of what we talked about in the last segment in terms of malt modification and what we know about pale 2-row. My understanding is that the malt you used here came from a big malt company, right?
Exactly.
RAR or whatever it might have been.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it is notably hot. And so you would expect with a modern malt like this, at least I would expect, that by 30 minutes in, you're probably 90+% converted already to what the 60-minute mash would be. And to me, in my head, I'm thinking that's not going to make much of a difference at all. But who knows? Maybe it will have a perceptible impact.
Yeah. So very simple next step is me mashing, and we're going to mash both of these beers at 150 Fahrenheit or 66 degrees Celsius. Now, this is where the split starts. One of these batches was held for 30 minutes versus one of the batches was held for 60 minutes.
Yep. And again, 30 minutes versus 60 minutes. We're looking at the 30-minute mark in part because it's half of 60, and we like those nice, clean numbers.
Yeah, we like clean numbers.
Yeah.
Yes.
But also because, this is my own opinion at least, you can tell us what you think, Andy, but because of the experiment that Kai did, 15 years ago or whatever, that 30-minute mark is where they say, hey, that's about where that conversion is going to start to wane off a little bit, and it's really not going to make much of a difference. Might we do a 15-minute mash in the future? I think we should, right?
Yeah,
but in this one, I think it's it was clean of us to do a 30 versus 60-minute mash, and you got a lot of people out there saying, whoa, 30 minutes, what a waste, right? You're gonna lose so much by doing that.
Yeah. So let's find out. So when the mashes were complete, we moved the grains through the bag and sparge to collect identical volumes of pre-boil wort, and then we boiled both worts for 60 minutes. So very simple hopping. This is not a hoppy beer, so very simple hops. It's 30 grams of Liberty at 60 minutes for bitter and 14 grams of Cascade at 15 minutes. Very simple. After boiling, the worts were chilled, then racked into two sanitized Delta firm tanks. At this point, I took original gravity readings for both, and there was a slight difference we found here. So 30-minute mash had an OG of 1052 versus a 60-minute mash had an OG of 1053.
Real world. Does that even matter?
I really don't think so. Again, I talk about measurement issues, and in my work, in my professional job, I definitely harangue people for not adding error bars to things. And the error bars in this measurement is a point maybe, and so it does make, if you want to say these are accurate measurements, say these are correct, these are valid. Well, we mashed longer and we got another point. This kind of proves Kai's measurement, which is you mash a little longer, you get another point. But does that really? What is the impact? Is that 30 minutes? The 30 minutes of my life spent waiting for this, did that matter? I'm not sure. So
well, and I think this speaks to it. Certainly demonstrates, which we have shown before. When I do my short and shoddy batches and I mash for 30 minutes, I get lower overall efficiency than when I'm doing a 60-minute mash. That has been very consistent, and this shows that if you mash for half the time, you could potentially, that just supports that claim. You could potentially get a little bit lower OG to start, but one specific gravity point. I mean, I don't think any commercial brewer is even going to care about that.
No,
that's not a big deal at all. Obviously, there are other things that could come with this reduced, as people claimed, at least years and years ago, used to claim other things that could come along with this. But for OG and overall conversion, I'm pretty confident here that there's not much of a difference.
Yeah. So once that was pumped in and put down to chilled, we chilled the worts down to 66 Fahrenheit or 19C in those firm tanks. And at that point, I pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast A01 or the house strain into both. Mm-hmm. After a week of fermentation, I crank up the fermentation chamber to 70 Fahrenheit or 21C to make sure the beers are finished out. And then a few days later, I took hydrometer measurements. So the finishing gravity or the final gravity measurements, the 30-minute mash had a finishing gravity of 1.010, leaving you with a 5.5% ABV beer, or the 60-minute was left with a finishing gravity of 1.009 or 5.8 ABV. So slight differences here.
Yeah, very slight differences, and I think there's some curious stuff to discuss as well. Overall, if you're looking at apparent attenuation, the 30-minute mash clocked in at about 80.8% attenuation, while the 60-minute mash was about 2.2% higher, 83% apparent attenuation. Mm-hmm. Again, nothing huge, but what I find interesting is that the 30-minute mash, which started at a lower OG, finished at a higher FG, which to me says that temperature, that one of the things that people will say is a positive about reducing the mash length is that there's going to be less fluctuation in your mash temperature because it's not sitting there for as long over time. Now, I know that you pump because the Brewzilla systems that you brew on have a pump, and that will help to keep that the temperature a little bit more consistent than say what I do. I don't like using pumps at all. And so even when I'm doing a 1 hour mash, I'm going to let it sit there. I might put a lid on the mash to kind of retain some of that temp, but it could drop a good 4 degrees. Usually in the wintertime here in Fresno, it's not freezing, but I've seen a 4-degree drop. So if I'm aiming for 154, I start at 154. By 30 minutes in, it might be down to 153, 152, but by an hour in, it could be down to 150 or so. And so maybe that, we were talking a little bit about beta and alpha amylase enzymes and how those work at different temperatures. It's possible, or at least one argument that I've heard from some people is that as you let that go, then those beta amylase enzymes are going to start kicking in and doing their thing a little bit more as that wort chills, because not all of them have been denatured yet.
Correct. So you have this, we've tried denaturing as you go higher in temperature. So if you start really hot, 165, and let it cool down, you're probably not going to access those lower temperature enzymes anymore because they don't exist. They don't exist. They don't go to zero. You don't kill all of them, but you will denature enough of them that you won't be that process. So we've just mashed longer. So I think, like we're extracting more and we're making it more fermentable because the cool off, even though I am recirculating on the Brewzillas, they aren't insulated, right? So you're going to have some temperature fluctuation and you can't pump too quickly. So it's more than just leaving it sit idle and without no temperature, but it isn't as efficient or as heat as a bigger system. So
yeah, and it's funny. One of the things that I'll hear people talk about, this is we're going off topic here, but one of the things I'll hear people talking about in terms terms of Fahrenheit versus Celsius is that with Fahrenheit, it's so detailed, the differences are so minute that when, if you're looking at it in terms of Celsius, that is technically, I mean, you're looking at like 2 degrees Fahrenheit is about what it takes to change in terms of Celsius 1 degree. And so, and that's not a rule. That's just kind of a rule of thumb that I go by. So you're looking at a drop of, a degree or 2 Fahrenheit. You're still in the same, technically at the same temp, Celsius wise. Yes. But we, in America here, we sit and we look and we're like, crap, I lost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Probably not a big deal. Regardless, in this case, it does look like, that's what I'm chalking this up to, is that 60-minute mash probably just had a little bit more mash temp fluctuation, and that may have made that wort slightly more fermentable. I'm not sure. It's kind of a secondary function of the variable here. I don't think the mash length specifically is what caused this. I do think the OG was a function of mash length specifically. Yes,
I do. Agreed. So beers are done. We're fermented. We need a package. So pressure transferred both beers into CO2 purged kegs that were placed in a keezer. They were allowed to condition for a week before they were ready for evaluation. So you'd have carbonate, all that kind of stuff. So objective observations, they look the same. I couldn't tell a difference. I don't know if you could, Marshall, but I think these are identical beers in terms of appearance. And then, like we do at Brewlosophy, we do the blind triangle test with people outside of it. They don't know the variable whatsoever, but we like to do an internal one. And what we do is we mix up cups internally with myself, so it becomes like a semi-blind triangle test. Yeah. And out of 10 of these, I was correct only 4 times.
That's not significant, by the way.
Not significant. I thought these beers were identical in both appearance and in flavor, and all the organoleptic perception. These were the same beers.
Yeah, and not to toot Andy's horn, buddy, but all of us have a lot of experience, not only brewing but drinking beer, evaluating beer. Most of us have judged in competitions. That's not to say that we have better palates than anybody else, but on top of all of that, you knew the variable and still could not distinguish these beers with any consistency or reliability. Now, I'm looking at the pictures, and like you said, they look just identical. It looks like you could have poured them from the same tap, exactly. To my eyes. So it from that alone, with what you said about your personal experience, testing these beers out, and then also what we're seeing, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. Now, I think you did a very good thing. This was kind of during a weird time of the COVID quarantine. We weren't able to get as many participants as we would have liked, but you did go out and serve these to 16 participants and have them. Now, these participants had no idea what the variable was. They're given 3 beers. 2 of the cups have the same exact beer. 1 of the cups has the different beer, and they're asked to pick the one that's different. Out of those 16, 9 would have had to identify that odd beer out, that unique sample, in order for us to say, with any confidence at least, that there really does seem to be an impact of the variable. There does seem to be a difference between the 60-minute mash beer and the 30-minute mash beer. Out of those 16, how many people actually identified the unique sample?
Only 6 got it right, quote unquote right. So that is not significant in our books. So
yeah, that's 37.5%. Now it randomly. You're at 50, you would expect 33.3% in a triangle test to pick each color. This is pretty damn close. 6 people out of 16. And what we can chalk that up to is you got to guess something, right? And yes. Randomness is random. I like to say that. I had to teach a stats course one time, and I would always say randomness is random. It's not predictable. It's random. That's why we call it random. So obviously there might be a cup that people just randomly pick more than the other. And in fact, we have seen, not in Brewlosophy, I have seen in research false positives because of the randomness of randomness, right? Yeah. You see that sometimes, and that's why replication is key. Now, we've replicated this mash link thing a few times, and this continues to support the notion that a 30-minute mash really doesn't seem to be, deleterious to beer.
Yeah, and again, we go to deleterious versus perceptible versus choice, right? So, we talked about doing 15, it's like a 60 versus a 15. Now, I would be interested in doing that one because the distance between the two is more, right?
That's right.
What if the small difference between 60 and 30, and then you do 15, 30? What if those two are more similar than you think? 15, 60, that's a much bigger difference, right? So those choices that we make are important too, right? And it goes from, is the beer different or is the beer significantly worse in some ways? It is. There's actually an interesting data point, is that we typically take not only data on, do you taste a difference, like which cup or which beer do you prefer?
Yeah.
And almost all the time, there is a split in the middle. Very rarely do you see the whole group decide that this beer is better than the other beer, right? That's very rare. So.
Super rare. The only time I can remember doing that is I did somebody, a fan of Brewlosophy years ago, sent me some old Simcoe hops they had. Ooh. And they had they had them vacuum sealed, but the vacuum seal didn't hold its vacuum. And so there was oxygen in there, and they'd been sitting out out, not in a freezer and all of this. And they were like 4 years older than this fresh Simcoe I had. Well, what I later learned was likely due to this high beta acid content, which is incredibly sharp. It's like this sharp lingering bitterness that I do not like. That when I compared those two beers, right, I made a beer with just the Simcoe. I made a beer, the fresher Simcoe. I made a beer with this old oxidized Simcoe, and that old oxidized Simcoe was awful. That beer was so bitter, and all but one person said they liked. There was a significant finding, and all but one person said they liked the fresh Simcoe better. So that's the only time I've ever seen that I can recall a not so even split. But like you said, it's totally subjective. There might be people out there who do enjoy that. But when it comes to this mash length experiment, I think, again, this is one of those things that can be really beneficial to those people who, maybe want to wake up in the morning and brew a batch while their family is still asleep, before they have to take their kids to school, before they have to go to work, or whatever it may be. When they get home from work and they want to slap together a beer real quickly without it impeding on their life too much, to be able to cut half an hour out of your mash, and then we've done a lot of boil length experiments as well. To be able to have that time, to save that time, I think could be really beneficial for some people.
Absolutely. I'm considering it too, like looking at this data. There's one thing for us to keep the things the same, keep our processes the same throughout all these experiments and stuff. But I can also be like, hey, I could use that half hour, right? It just depends on what your personal preferences are and what your time schedules are like, right?
Yeah.
I see it an immense benefit to cutting 30 minutes just because it saves me time on the electric systems that just take so much longer at 120 volts than if I had propane or 220. So
yeah. Well, obviously mash length did appear to have a small impact on the OG, FG, and attenuation. So I think that's important to point out. There were these objectively measurable differences, but again, people struggled to perceive a difference between the beers, and I think that's pretty cool. And like I said, it could be that mash length matters a little bit more at warmer temperatures. If you're doing a warmer mash, or with higher OG beers, or there's all of these other things. And that's what keeps us going, is that we have all of these other kind of sub variables to look at when we're looking at these kind of the pointed variables like mash length. Now, we got a couple of reader comments I'd like to get to. The first one comes from Dave, who says 60 minutes never made sense to me. It's just something easy to remember and almost always works. But chemistry doesn't know that humans divided the day into 24 time segments, and that we use one segment for timing the mash step.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. This is a spot-on analysis. It's very psychological or sociological to pick 60. Philosophical even, so absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Dave. I think about time all the time and how arbitrary it is, and the fact that humans have kind of organized it such that we kind of understand it in these ways. But yeah, science doesn't understand time. It is what it is, and things happen at certain time. It could be that, for example, that conversion occurs at 28.2 minutes. Who knows? But we go 60 minutes to keep it safe, and I think it makes sense. So, Elliot Specht says, your brewing conditions are obviously better controlled than mine. While a 30-minute mash worked just fine with optimal temperature and pH, I suspect a 60-minute mash may provide better conversion under less optimal conditions.
Oh, that's true. I mean, like we said, chemical reactions happen kind of at their own timescales. And, if you're just trying to eliminate variables, like we do a lot of times, eliminate any change, right? 60 is overkill, but it's also not deleterious, right? Like I mentioned earlier, I've seen people do 3, 4, 5 hour long mashes. And really, those are schedule driven, right? I mash in the morning. I might go to work. I might come back at lunch and do something else, right? Or, I'm just trying to maximize my efficiency of time. Sometimes efficient time means doing something shorter. Sometimes it means doing something for much longer, right? Ferment dough, pizza dough, 48 hours, 72 hours. Well, is there a difference? I know Marshall's a big old pizza head, but these kind of things that you try and look at and say, what is the impact? What performance am I changing? And so that's an open question.
Yeah, it would be interesting to kind of adjust variables like the mash pH, which that's another one that I've kind of stopped focusing on too much, because I think just because modern malts, like 99% of the beers that I brew are going to, my mash pH naturally is going to fall in the kind of, ideal range, as it were. So, but it could be that a high pH with a lower mash temp really does does have a more noticeable impact than if both are at the same pH. Who knows? But
absolutely, yeah.
Good thought, Elliot. The final comment comes from somebody who goes by Me Gary, who says, "Thanks for the experiment. I'm wondering if a more complex malt bill would be the true beneficiary to a longer mash in both conversion and fermentability. I'm not sure though."
Yeah. So there was one experiment I did very many years ago. It was when I first looking at the mash temperature with a much more complicated grain bill, and we did see a significant result there. So, we've said in the past, we've done these, we've seen not significance, and sometimes you do get a significant result. Now, was that random luck, or was that actually a number? Right? Repeating those things is important. So I do have some belief in the grain composition matters, right? So we typically do these simple beers, right? Something that should be applicable. If you look at the history of brewing research, it's always been with light lager. Almost everything that you see in terms of a actual, I would say, more clinical experiment where there's many more controlled variables, many more samples are taken. N is hundreds of tests. You find that it's always the same type of beer. So it's a great question. We shouldn't ignore darker styles of beer, amber, stout, porter. Keeping them simple, right? Not too many ingredients, trying to keep them these results reproducible. But there could be something there because we're not exploring that. The few percent of unfermentable sugars or cooked sugars or Maillard reaction sugars that are left could be a big flavor inducer in these beers.
Yeah, when I think about stuff like this, I think about the confluence of factors, right? So I think porter is a perfect example. That is a style of beer, at least when I'm designing a porter, that I go a little bit heavy-handed on different types of malts. I tend to be a simple 1 to 3 grain type of guy. But when I'm brewing a porter, I'm cool with like a sprinkle of chocolate malt, a little bit of black malt for just to get ashy, whatever, and then some caramel malts, and then you got a base malt. I'm down with all of that. My guess would be, and again, this is utter speculation, but my guess would be that even if mash length had more of an objective difference because of the specialty grains or whatever else might be going into, say, something like a porter, I wonder if the strength of flavor from all of those extra ingredients, even if the OG is 3 specific gravity or 4 specific gravity points different, I wonder if you'd be able to perceive that difference anyways, just because of how rich that beer is in the end, right? And so it kind of creates this issue wherein, yes, we can show that there are these objective differences, but people still can't seem, from a sensory perspective, organoleptically speaking, can't seem to distinguish them. And so then you're left with this weird thing where it's like, well, I'm going to do it for the numbers, not necessarily for the flavor, right?
Yeah, and that's so at homebrewers, we almost, I know for many years prior to Brewlosophy, the dark ages, I would just do stuff, right? I was more of a cook in the brewery, not a analytic, right? So I would just do things. So I was not looking at numbers nearly as much, right? On the flip side, you have pro brewers, numbers is basically everything, right? They want to go for flavor, don't get it wrong. They want the best tasting beer possible, but numbers generate so much more of a choices in their brew house than just flavors. So
yeah, it's really interesting. Well, dude, that's all the time we've got for this episode on mash length when it comes to brewing blonde ale. Did you have anything else you wanted to say before we get going?
I think this is a great one. I think we always come back to it to reanalyze, especially if we have some new ingredient or something like that. And I think don't fear it. I think in general, you can't mash for 0 minutes. You can't mash for 24 hours. So there's a number in there somewhere that makes sense. Really, I think this just goes to show it's more about your own system. It's about your personal preferences and what schedule you want to keep. And don't worry about those extra 30 minutes. I don't think you're going to taste much of a difference, but you got to find out for yourself.
Yeah, and I'm a big proponent of tailor your brew day to what works for you. And if you like the beer in the end, then just keep doing what you're doing because that's all good. So, well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.